leave it for a minute. Hello, my name is Hugh Williams, and today is the 25th of January 2024, the Feast of the Conversion of St. Paul. I'm the Managing Director of St. Edward's Press, and the LFSPN have asked me to present this video, which is an interview in which I'm asked certain questions about my life and various things, because I'm unable, for health reasons, to attend in person and be able to meet you all. So I'm sorry I'm not in person, but I'm now ready for the first question.
Hugh Williams, would you please tell us a little bit about your background, please?
Yes, only too pleased to. I was born in 1946. My mother had lost her first husband in the Second World War, and my father had lost his first wife in the Second World War. They married and they just had me. They already had children, and so I was the sixth of six children. I always called myself the runt of the litter, and was happy to do so. I went to school at a prep school called St. Albans, from where I went to Eton, and after Eton I trained to be a chartered accountant. So publishing, when we talk about that, came much later in my life. My home was in a beautiful place called Warrington Park on the borders of Devon and Cornwall. I challenge it. I think it's the most beautiful country, sort of estate park in the whole of England. Beautiful, beautiful scenery. So I lived in the country and loved the country, still love the country. And my father had a herd of Red Devon cattle, which in due course I was going to find myself running a herd of Red Devons. Now, that gets us to me having trained as an accountant. Would you like to ask another question, or shall I just keep going?
Please do. Perhaps you might say something about your career, where you were living, particularly, I believe the Legion is interested in the rural life that you have enjoyed and the work you've done in the countryside, and indeed the education of your family.
Right. A lot of stuff, so I'll try and do it quickly. I trained as an accountant and I qualified in 1970, and I hated my training and I hated London, and decided in 1971 to leave London and head back to Cornwall, or the borders of Devon and Cornwall. My uncle had recently died and left me some money, and my plan was to go farming. But I started off by having lived in London and not really enjoyed London and led a bad life. I can't pretend that I was a good person at all. I lived with my parents and used the time really as sort of sabbatical. 6 months became 9 months, and looking for a farm to buy. And I eventually found a farm on Dartmoor, a wonderful farm called Lower Willsworth. When I say wonderful, it was just perfect as a place for bringing up children. And I bought this farm as a bachelor. I married Alice, my wife, in 1974. So we're, please God, heading for our golden wedding this year. And we had 5 children, the first 2 of whom we educated at home, and we took them up with the aid of qualified professional help. We took them to GCSE level, and then they went to the local comprehensive school. So we thoroughly enjoyed the business of home education. But living on a farm enabled us to have dogs and horses, and we had sheep and cattle and things like that. At that stage, we're talking about the 70s and 80s. I was I was farming, but I wasn't really hands-on with farming because I had a wonderful partner who helped me, and I was running my accountancy practice from a converted barn on the farm. Quite unusual to have an accountancy practice on the moor. But when my partner died, I then had to do all the farming myself, and I bought a small herd of Red Devons, which for the next sort of 8 years or so I did everything myself and absolutely loved. They're beautiful creatures, very easy to handle, and of course they produce delicious beef. As a breeder, I'd say it is the best beef, but of course there are other breeds like Hereford and Aberdeen Angus. Have I sort of covered, do you think, Daniel, what I should have done?
Yes, perhaps just a brief word about how your children benefited from living on the moor and the country life that they grew up with.
You remind me of a cartoon, a Punch cartoon that I have upstairs. And for those who don't know what Punch was, it was a sort of predecessor to Private Eye, but a much smarter and kinder predecessor to Private Eye. And it had this wonderful cartoon that my grandfather bought. I don't know if you've seen it, but it produced a very elegant young lady and a little boy, and she says to him, "Bobby, what are you going to do when you grow up?" And Bobby says, "I don't know what it's called, but it's living in the country with lots of horses and dogs and all that," which I've always thought was absolutely charming, and it actually reflects my ambition. I mean, I think I've been thinking about this discussion that we're going to have, and I think most of my contemporaries who left Eton with me probably had much more ambition than me, of wanting to be either successful in the city or in politics or things like that. And I'm afraid, I hope it's all right to say, my only ambition was to be happy. So I was very much like Bobby. That was what I wanted to do. And thanks be to God, for a long period of my life, that is what happened.
I think that you've mentioned politics.
Yes.
Viewers may be interested to know, before we move on to publishing, to hear a bit about your political life.
Yes, well, of course, I'm very excited to say today, because I was very close to my father. And 100 years ago, he was elected to Parliament for the Conservative Party. And there's a bit of a centenary there in my life, as it were. While I was in London, I thought, well, I better sort of follow in Dad's footsteps. And I joined the Young Conservatives, and I went and had a few sort of training sessions, being taught how to public speak and all that sort of thing. But in 1973, I decided to go to or maybe it was suggested, I went to the Conservative Party conference in Blackpool. And I have to say that week was the dullest of my life. I thought, if this is what politics is, I really don't want any part of it. And so I didn't do any more political work. Although with Alice, we both became quite busy in terms of, do we call it public service? We were Anglicans at that stage. We were hard-working members of the parochial church council. We were also in the parish council. I became deanery, members of the deanery synod. We do all that sort of thing. I'm getting towards my conversion. Is that all right to mention that?
Yes, certainly.
It seems it is all right. I worked on the National Park Committee. If I wasn't doing political work, party political work, I think I was doing political work, if you see what I mean, in my spare time, obviously, but happy to contribute rather than wanting to control. And as an Anglican, towards the end of the 70s, I thought, I loved all the people I worked with. I thought there's not enough going on in this church, the dear church of Peter Tavy, which is where we worship. That was the parish we lived in. That I need more fertilizer for my faith. It's not doing what it should do. And I went to the local vicar, and he said, well, there's a vacancy on the diocesan building committee. And I said, no, I don't want another admin job. I want my faith to grow. And at that stage, I had a very good friend who sadly since died, a man called Jeff Stevens, dear Australian, who we talked about serious things. He was a really, really good friend. And he suggested that I had dinner with a great friend of his called Martin Gwynn. And Martin Gwynn had recently been converted to Catholicism. And so this is in early 1979. We all went out to dinner in Brooks's Club in London. And Martin, being a convert, was, he couldn't, like all converts, he couldn't help himself but talking about Catholicism. And I was sort of not expecting that evening to develop in the way that it did. But I was riveted by what he said. And Martin turned to me and said, Hugh, you're half a Catholic already, which was the most extraordinary thing in a way for me, because I'd been pretty unhappy about Catholicism and Catholics generally. And but after the end of the evening, I remember sitting in the train in Victoria Station, waiting to go back to Virginia Water to join my wife and her parents, where I was spending the night or staying for a few days. And I felt that I was in love with the Catholic faith. And Chesterton calls Catholicism, or once becoming a Catholic, a grand and glorious love affair. And not that I knew that at the time. I reckoned that was the moment in which I thought, well, there's no turning back. I've got to go ahead. Now, shall I go on to explain about where that brought me? And it didn't take me to the Novus Ordo. One of the things that had frustrated me worshipping in Peter Tavy Parish was that we were stopping using the old, is it 1662 Book of Common Prayer, and being asked to use flimsy leaflets called Series 3, which were always falling apart in our hands with them. And the moment I saw what the Novus Ordo was, I thought, well, this is Series 3. I don't want anything to do with that. And Martin suggested that we get instructed by, because Alice was with me at the time, that we get instructed by Monsignor Gilby in London, and sometimes he came to stay with us at home. So we were very much instructed in the traditional faith, and the one thing we didn't discuss with Father Gilby until the end, until we were ready to be received, was the position of the then John Paul II. And we wrote to Father Gilby to try and get some explanation as to what we should do next. And the most extraordinary thing happened, because we were very fond of him, and I think he was very fond of us. I mean, he was a lovely man. He's since died. And the most extraordinary thing was that he never answered the letter. And I wrote again, and he never answered our letter. And we suddenly realized, on the basis of by their fruits ye shall know them, that we had to be very careful and stay clear of the Novus Ordo Church. And so we become, I suppose, can I use the word sedevacantis? That I'm getting the nod for that. And that's a position I've held ever since. And if I say very happily, I mean, obviously one's very sad at the terrible state of the church at the moment, but at no point during those, it's 40 years now, have I thought that I wanted to change my mind or been tempted to go back into what one might call mainstream. I call myself, I don't know if this is the right thing to say, I call myself an unchanged Catholic. In other words, I try to follow exactly what should have been done by a layperson without the aid of priests and the sacraments and things like that before the Second Vatican Council. Have I? You must bully me if I'm not doing it right.
I think you've given plenty of food for thought.
Probably too much.
Well, let them be the judge.
Exactly.
Of that. Yeah. I think before we finish this section of the interview, which is to introduce you, and you're giving an excellent account of your background. Thank you. The political side of your life. We only got as far as
not wanting to do
the Conservative Party in the 70s. Yeah. Perhaps if you just take that to the current day,
yeah,
and then we'll start on the subject of St. Edward's Press.
Perfect. Well, having not decided to plough the Conservative furrow, I did all these other things as I mentioned, and then in the sort of mid to late 80s, I was beginning to worry about what was going on in the European Union. And I did a bit of research and came across something called Business for Sterling, an organisation which was trying to protect sterling from the EU sort of turning us all. We didn't have the euro at that stage, but that was the plan. And I found myself talking to, he'd be embarrassed if I mentioned his name, but somebody who subsequently became a government minister, who was the chair of this organisation, said, look, I think I better own up. I want us to come out of the European Union. And he said, yeah, that's not what we're about. And so I left them and was sort of worried about what was going on, didn't have a home. And so in the early 70s, early 90s. Yes, that's right. In the early 90s, I must remember my dates. I was getting extremely worried about what was going on, and eventually I was introduced to UKIP, and by my daughter Emily, eldest daughter Emily, who'd been talking to people who were members of UKIP, said, "Dad, I think you better come along and see." And so I did that, and in the 1997 election, having hitherto always voted Conservative, and thinking, well, UKIP is what now offers me what I want politically. I want to vote for them because they stand for what I believe in. And I remember going into the polling station thinking, goodness me, am I the first member of my family not to vote Conservative? Am I going to feel that I've been a traitor when I leave the polling station? And as I came out of the polling station, I actually felt that I'd been cleansed. I'd voted for what I believed in. And of course, UKIP didn't do very well at that stage, 1997. But I kept my interest going. And thanks to Emily, I found myself having to put my name forward we're talking about 2005, that's right, as a UKIP candidate for Southwest Devon, and then in 2010 I did the same again, and I kept my deposit, I'm pleased to say, but I thought I won't stand anymore because I'd be really I think I'd been 68 if I'd stood in 2015, which was the next election, but I found myself getting to know various people in UKIP, and was sort of, without really meaning to, going up the ladder a bit. And I eventually found myself as treasurer, national treasurer of UKIP, which was a great thrill to look back on the fact that I was national treasurer of UKIP at the time when, in 2015, or do I mean, no, 2014, I think it was. I can't remember, one of those two elections, we did incredibly well in both. In 2014, we won the Euros, and in 2015, we got nearly 4 million votes. So I'm very pleased to have been part of UKIP at that stage. Does that cover it too much, too little? Or?
I think it covers it very nicely. Perhaps as a closing thought, the UKIP at the time wasn't merely a party of disgruntled conservatives. I know you enjoyed the fact that people came from the left and the right,
I loved
united
that.
in that cause.
It was fabulous to meet former both liberals and socialists, and to suddenly find we had common ground. It was just wonderful.
Well, I think that happily concludes the first section of this interview.
Okay, so we'll do a pause for that. Yeah.